May 19th, 2023, 11:47 p.m. Anna's home, Manhattan penthouse. The sound of laughter spilled out from the guest bedroom, sharp and alive. I sat on the couch nursing my third glass of Bordeaux, half listening to the city noise beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah and Daniel were staying over for the weekend, a spur-of-the-moment idea Sarah had thought would be fun and bonding. I hadn't objected. Yet, here I was, alone in my living room while my daughter and her husband were God knows where, basking in their youth and spontaneity. But that night, something shifted. The laughter coming from their room suddenly stopped, replaced by low murmurs that sounded far too intimate for comfort. My heart stilled. Was I paranoid? Or had Daniel just said my name? The wine had loosened my restraint, and without thinking, I moved closer to the door. My feet made no sound on the plush rug. I leaned in, holding my breath. "You don't understand," Daniel's voice came, hushed but insistent. "Daniel, stop. We can't talk about this here." That was Sarah, her tone defensive and clipped. "I can't help it. She's in my head all the time." My stomach flipped, and I stumbled back, the floor tilting beneath me. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped out, his eyes going wide when he saw me standing there. "Anna," he said, his voice breaking the silence like a guilty teenager caught sneaking out. "Were you listening?" I cut him off, straightening my posture. "No. Should I have been?" Before he could answer, Sarah appeared behind him, her face flushed. She had the look of someone who had been caught but didn't yet know what crime she'd committed. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Nothing," Sarah said quickly, stepping between us. "Daniel was just venting about his job. That's all." Daniel's eyes flicked to hers, then back to me, and I knew she was lying. Whatever they were hiding, it wasn't just about work. The next morning, I woke early, the memory of the previous night gnawing at me. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the coffee maker in the kitchen. To my surprise, Daniel was already up, sitting at the kitchen island with his hair mussed and his shirt wrinkled. "You're up early," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He looked up at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "Couldn't sleep?" I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. But Daniel wasn't finished. "About last night," he began, trailing off. "Let's not do this," I said, cutting him off as I slid into the seat across from him. "Whatever it is, it's none of my business." "But it is," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You're a part of this family. You've been more of a parent to me than my own ever were." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I saw a crack in his carefully curated facade. Beneath the charm and bravado, Daniel was a boy drowning in expectations he could never meet. "Daniel," I began, my tone softening. "I don't belong here, Anna," he said, cutting me off. "In this world, in your world, I don't fit. And Sarah knows it." "That's nonsense," I said, reaching for his hand before I could stop myself. "Sarah loves you. And if you'd stop feeling so sorry for yourself, you might see that." Our eyes met, and something passed between us. A spark, brief but undeniable. I pulled my hand back as if burned. By noon, the tension had eased somewhat. Sarah suggested a family outing, and we spent the afternoon wandering through Central Park. But even as we laughed and joked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all playing roles, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. That night, after Sarah went to bed, Daniel found me in the living room. I was curled up on the couch with a book, trying to lose myself in someone else's story. "You're still up?" I asked without looking up. "I couldn't sleep again," he said, sinking into the armchair opposite me. I sighed and set my book down. "Is this going to become a habit?" "Maybe," he said, a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. There was a long pause, the kind that felt heavier than silence. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Depends," I replied, folding my arms. "Why don't you date?" The question caught me off guard, and I barked out a laugh. "Excuse me?" "You're an incredible woman, Anna," he said, leaning forward. Smart, beautiful, successful. You could have anyone you wanted. Flattery will get you nowhere, I said, my tone light, though my pulse quickened. I'm serious, he said, his voice dropping. Why haven't you moved on? For a moment, I considered brushing him off, but something about the intensity of his gaze made me hesitate. I have Sarah, I said finally, and for a long time that was enough. But it isn't anymore, is it? I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was right. The turning point came 3 nights later. Sarah had gone to visit a friend, leaving Daniel and me alone in the apartment. We ordered takeout and sat on the couch, the space between us shrinking with every passing hour. At some point, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. Anna, I need to tell you something. What is it? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, cursed under his breath, and shoved it back into his pocket. Tell me, I pressed. I can't, he said, running a hand through his hair. Not yet. Frustration bubbled up inside me, but I forced it down. Then don't, I said coolly. I don't have time for games, Daniel. This isn't a game, he said, his voice sharp. This is my life. And Sarah's, I shot back. He flinched, and for a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. But then he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You think I don't know that? He said. You think I don't feel the weight of it every goddamn day? Our eyes locked, and the air between us crackled with unspoken tension. What do you want from me, Daniel? I whispered. His answer was immediate and devastating. I don't know. May 23rd, 2023, 10:37 p.m. Anna's penthouse living room. The city lights glittered beyond the glass, a million stars trapped in Manhattan's skyline. Daniel sat across from me, swirling his whiskey like a man trying to drown something inside him. I should have gone to bed hours ago, but something kept me anchored to the couch. Maybe it was the raw vulnerability in his voice, or maybe it was my own loneliness clawing its way to the surface. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, breaking the silence. Like what? I asked, though I already knew. This life, he said, gesturing vaguely. Marriage, expectations, the pressure to be someone I'm not. Sometimes, I feel like I'm suffocating. I studied him, the flicker of light from the nearby lamp casting shadows across his face. He looked older than his years, worn down by a life that had demanded too much too soon. You love Sarah, don't you? I asked, my voice soft. Of course I do, he said, his eyes snapping to mine. But sometimes I feel like she's a reflection of you. Strong, independent, untouchable. And me? He laughed bitterly. I'm just a screw-up trying to keep up. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. You're not a screw-up, Daniel. Then why does it feel like I'm failing at everything? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Without thinking, I reached out and placed a hand on his arm. You're not failing, I said firmly. You're human, and humans make mistakes. For a moment, neither of us moved. His eyes dropped to my hand, and I realized too late that I'd crossed a line. But before I could pull away, his hand covered mine. Anna, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The air between us felt electric, charged with something dangerous and forbidden. I should have stood up, walked away, done anything to break the spell. But I didn't. I think you should go to bed, I said finally, my voice trembling. He hesitated, then nodded. Good night, Anna. As I watched him disappear down the hallway, my heart pounded in my chest. What the hell was I doing? The next day, I threw myself into work, desperate for a distraction. But Daniel's words replayed in my mind like a broken record. By the time evening rolled around, I was wound tighter than a spring. Sarah came home late, her face flushed with excitement. Mom, you won't believe it, she said, practically bouncing into the living room. What is it? I asked, forcing a smile. Daniel's been offered a new job. A big one. He hasn't told you yet? No, I said, my stomach twisting. He's waiting for the details, but it sounds amazing. I knew he could do it. Her pride was palpable, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be the thing that saved them, that pulled Daniel out of his downward spiral. But then, that night, Daniel came to me again. May 24th, 2023, 12:13 a.m. Anna's study. I was reviewing reports when he knocked on the door. "Come in," I called, expecting Sarah. Instead, Daniel walked in, his face tense. "We need to talk," he said, shutting the door behind him. "Is everything okay?" I asked, setting my papers aside. "No, Anna, it's not." He crossed the room and sat down across from me, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I got the job offer," he said finally. "That's wonderful," I said, smiling. "Is it?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "It's in Seattle." The words hit me like a truck. "Seattle?" "Yeah. They want me to start next month. It's a great opportunity, but I don't want to leave." "Daniel," I began, but he cut me off. "Don't," he said, his voice low and pained. "Don't pretend you don't know why." My throat tightened. "This isn't about me, isn't it?" He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know when it happened, Anna, but you've gotten under my skin. I can't stop thinking about you." "Stop," I said, standing up. "You're confused, Daniel. You're projecting." "Don't do that," he said, standing to face me. "Don't dismiss what I'm feeling." "Sarah is your wife," I said, my voice rising. "I know," he snapped, "and I love her, but I can't lie to myself anymore. You and I, there's something here, Anna. You feel it too, don't you?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was right. "Get out," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Anna, get out." He stared at me for a long moment, his face a mixture of anger and pain. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, Sarah was gone again, off to some networking event. Daniel avoided me all day, barely making eye contact when we crossed paths. I told myself it was for the best, that we needed space to let things settle. But that night, everything came to a head. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the knock on my door. My heart jumped, and I knew it was him before I even opened it. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice low. "I can't leave it like this," he said, his voice raw. "Leave what?" "Us." "There is no us," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Then tell me you feel nothing," he said, stepping closer. "Look me in the eye, and tell me this means nothing to you." I tried to hold his gaze, but the intensity in his eyes was too much. "That's what I thought," he said softly. Before I could respond, he reached out and cupped my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek. For a moment, I thought I would push him away, but then I felt myself leaning in. The kiss was desperate, electric, and completely wrong. When we finally pulled apart, I felt a rush of guilt and exhilaration. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then stop me," he said, his breath warm against my skin. But I didn't. May 26th, 2023, 2:45 p.m. Anna's penthouse, Manhattan. By the time Sarah returned from her business trip, the tension in the apartment was suffocating. I could barely meet her eyes, and Daniel's forced cheerfulness only made things worse. Every moment he and I shared in the same room felt like a ticking time bomb. "Mom, what's with the weird energy in here?" Sarah asked as we sipped coffee together in the kitchen. "Did you and Daniel have another one of your debates about his potential?" I smiled weakly, avoiding her gaze. "We're just different people," I said vaguely. Sarah laughed. "You don't say." Daniel walked in at that moment, his hair damp from the shower and his shirt clinging to him just a little too perfectly. He froze when he saw us, his eyes darting to mine before quickly looking away. "Morning," he mumbled, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. "It's almost 3, Sarah teased, standing to kiss him on the cheek. I looked away, my stomach twisting. The intimacy between them was unbearable now, a cruel reminder of the line I'd crossed. The evening came quickly, and with it, another family dinner. Sarah insisted we celebrate Daniel's job offer, though she remained blissfully unaware of his reluctance to leave. The dining room sparkled under the chandelier's light, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. But the atmosphere at the table was anything but warm. "So, Seattle," I said, breaking the silence as I poured another glass of wine. "Excited?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Sarah before answering. "It's a big change," he said, "but a good one, I think." "You think?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp. "It's just a lot to process," Daniel said, shifting uncomfortably. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "We've talked about this, Daniel. This is your chance to finally do something meaningful. Why are you hesitating?" "I'm not," he said quickly. "I just need to stop overthinking and commit," Sarah interrupted, her frustration clear. "Sarah," I said softly, trying to diffuse the tension. "No, Mom," she snapped. "He does this all the time. Gets in his own way and then blames the circumstances." Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "I'm not blaming anyone," he said, his voice low and steady. "But maybe if you weren't always telling me how to live my life, I wouldn't feel like I'm drowning." The words hung in the air like a slap. Sarah stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and hurt. "I'm going for a walk," Daniel said abruptly, pushing his chair back and leaving the room. "Unbelievable," Sarah muttered, crossing her arms. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But how could I, when I was part of the problem? May 26th, 2023, 10:18 p.m. Anna's penthouse terrace. I found Daniel on the terrace hours later, leaning against the railing and staring out at the city lights. He didn't turn when I approached, and for a moment, I considered leaving him to his thoughts. But the pull between us was too strong to ignore. "Sarah's worried about you," I said, breaking the silence. "She's always worried about me," he said bitterly, "because I'm the screw-up she has to fix." "You're not a screw-up," I said firmly, stepping closer. He turned to face me, his expression raw. "Then why does it feel like I'll never be enough? Not for her, not for you." The words hit like a lightning bolt, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "Daniel, stop," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't what?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Acknowledge what's happening between us? Pretend it doesn't exist?" "There's nothing to acknowledge," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "Liar," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. Before I could respond, he kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no pretense. It was desperate and consuming, and I felt myself giving in even as my mind screamed for me to stop. When we finally broke apart, I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "This has to end," I said, my voice trembling. "It won't," he said, his voice steady. "You know it won't." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding. May 27th, 2023, 7:15 a.m. Anna's penthouse. I woke to the sound of raised voices. Throwing on a robe, I hurried downstairs to find Sarah and Daniel in the middle of a heated argument. "You're seriously considering not taking the job?" Sarah was saying, her voice incredulous. "I didn't say that," Daniel replied, his tone defensive. "Then what are you saying, Daniel? That you'd rather stay here and rot?" "I'm saying I need time to think." "You've had time," Sarah snapped, "and all you've done is wallow and make excuses." "That's enough," I said, stepping between them. Sarah turned to me, her eyes blazing. "Mom, stay out of this." "No," I said firmly. "This isn't the way to solve anything." Sarah glared at me, then turned on her heel and stormed out. Daniel watched her go, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "She's right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a coward." "No," I said, placing a hand on his arm. "You're human." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. And in that moment, I knew we were past the point of no return. May 29th, 2023, 3:40 p.m. Anna's penthouse. The days that followed were a blur of tension and half-truths. Sarah and Daniel barely spoke, their conversations reduced to clipped sentences and icy stares. I tried to keep my distance, but Daniel's presence loomed over everything like a shadow. That afternoon, I found myself alone in the living room, sipping tea and pretending to read a book. The sound of the front door closing made me look up. Sarah had left for her afternoon meeting, and Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, walking toward me. I set the book down, my heart pounding. "There's nothing to talk about." "There's everything to talk about," he said, sitting across from me. "I can't keep pretending, Anna. This thing between us, it's real." "Stop," I said sharply, cutting him off. Sarah could come back any moment. "But she isn't here now," he said, his voice softening. "And you know as well as I do that this isn't going away." "You're her husband," I said, my voice trembling. "This is wrong." "Do you think I don't know that?" he said, his frustration evident. "I hate myself for what I feel, but I can't turn it off. And neither can you." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was right. May 30th, 2023, 12:52 a.m. Anna's bedroom. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. Groggily, I reached for it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. "I need to see you." I stared at the message, my mind racing. After a long moment, I typed a single word in reply, "No." But less than 5 minutes later, there was a knock at my bedroom door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Anna," Daniel whispered from the other side. "Please." I sat up, debating whether to answer. But before I could decide, the door opened, and he stepped inside. "What are you doing?" I hissed, pulling the covers up to my chest. "I couldn't stay away," he said, closing the door behind him. "You need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you really want me to?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He crossed the room, his movements slow and deliberate, and sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell me to leave, Anna. If you really want me to go, just say the word." But I didn't. June 1st, 2023, 8:15 p.m. Anna's terrace. For days, I avoided Sarah as much as possible, guilt eating away at me. Daniel, however, seemed emboldened by what had happened between us. He sought me out constantly, his touches lingering, his looks loaded with meaning. "You're playing with fire," I told him one evening as we stood on the terrace, the city sprawled out before us. "Maybe," he said, leaning against the railing, "but I've never felt more alive." I turned to him, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here? If Sarah finds out, she won't," he said, cutting me off. "You don't know that," I snapped. "And even if she doesn't, I'll know. I can't live with this, Daniel. I can't live with myself." "Then stop pretending this is one-sided," he said, his voice rising. "You want me just as much as I want you. Stop fighting it." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died on my lips. Because he was right. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening made us both freeze. "Mom? Daniel?" Sarah's voice called out. Panic shot through me, and I stepped away from him, smoothing my dress as I walked back inside. "Out here," I called, my voice trembling slightly. Sarah appeared a moment later, her eyes darting between us. "What are you two doing out here?" "Just talking," I said quickly. "About what?" "Your job," Daniel said smoothly, his charm slipping into place like a mask. "Your mom's worried about you taking on too much." Sarah rolled her eyes. "I'm fine. You two worry too much." Her obliviousness only made the guilt worse. June 3rd, 2023, 11:30 a.m. Anna's study. I was reviewing documents for work when Sarah burst into the room, her face pale and stricken. "What's wrong?" I asked, standing up. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking. "I found messages on his phone." My blood ran cold. "What kind of messages?" "From another woman," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know who she is, but it's been going on for weeks." My heart pounded in my chest. Sarah, I'm done, she said, cutting me off. I can't do this anymore. He's been lying to me, Mom, and I can't believe I didn't see it sooner. She turned and stormed out, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. I should have felt relief that she didn't suspect the truth, but all I felt was crushing shame. June 4th, 2023, 9 p.m. Anna's penthouse, Manhattan. The storm hit that night. Sarah had spent the day with her friend, leaving Daniel and me alone in the apartment. The air was thick with unspoken words, and by evening, I was ready to break. This has to stop, I told him as we stood in the living room. Daniel leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. You keep saying that, but you don't mean it. I do, I said firmly. For Sarah's sake, for my sake, we need to end this before it destroys everything. He took a step toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. It's already destroyed, he said softly. You know it, and so do I. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak, the sound of the front door opening made us both freeze. Sarah walked in, her expression tight and guarded. Mom, Daniel, she said, her voice unnervingly calm. We need to talk. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. What's going on? She crossed the room and set her bag down on the counter, her movements deliberate. I had a long talk with Lily today, she said, referring to her best friend. She reminded me of something I'd been ignoring for too long. And what's that? Daniel asked, his voice careful. That the truth always comes out, Sarah said, her eyes locking onto mine. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay composed. What are you trying to say, Sarah? I know, she said, her voice trembling. I know about you and Daniel. The room fell silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find the right words, but none came. How long? She asked, her eyes blazing with anger. How long has this been going on? Sarah, don't lie to me, she snapped, cutting me off. I want the truth. I glanced at Daniel, but he said nothing, his face pale. Taking a deep breath, I met her gaze. It wasn't supposed to happen, I said quietly. It just did. Her laugh was bitter, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the silence. That's your excuse? It just happened? I never meant to hurt you, I said, my voice breaking. But you did, she said, tears streaming down her face. You both did. June 5th, 2023, 10 a.m. Anna's penthouse. The next morning, Sarah was gone. She left a note on the kitchen counter saying she needed time and space to think. Daniel was nowhere to be found, leaving me alone with my guilt. Hours later, I got a call from Sarah. I'm filing for divorce, she said, her voice cold and detached. And I want you to stay out of it. Sarah, please. No, Mom, she interrupted. You've done enough. I can't even look at you right now. The line went dead, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. June 10th, 2023, 7 p.m. Manhattan Cafe. Days passed in a blur of regret and self-recrimination. Then, one evening, I got a text from Daniel asking to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We sat across from each other in a quiet corner of the cafe, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. She's leaving me, Daniel said, breaking the silence. I know, I said softly. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. I never wanted this, Anna. I never wanted to hurt her. Then why did you? I asked, my voice laced with anger. Because I'm broken, he said simply, and you made me feel whole. His words were like a dagger to the heart. We were wrong, I said, about everything. I know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. We sat in silence for a long moment, the magnitude of our actions settling between us. I'm leaving, he said finally, for Seattle. Maybe it's time I started over. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As he stood to leave, he hesitated, his eyes searching mine. Take care of her, he said, and then he was gone. June 20th, 2023, 8 a.m. Anna's penthouse. Sarah came to see me 10 days later. She stood in the doorway, her expression guarded but calm. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said. "At least not yet." "I understand," I said, my voice trembling. "But I wanted you to know that I'll be okay," she continued. "Eventually. And I hope you'll find a way to forgive yourself." Her words were a small mercy, a lifeline in the wreckage of everything we destroyed. As she turned to leave, I called out to her, "Sarah." She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. She nodded, then walked away, leaving me to face the consequences of my choices. And in that moment, I realized that some wounds never heal. They simply become part of who we are.